The streets were always busy, filled with the hum of life. People rushing to work, kids laughing, cars honking. But in the midst of all that noise, there was one man who seemed invisible. For 17 years, he sat on the same corner, his face weathered by time, his clothes tattered, and his eyes carrying a story no one bothered to ask about. He was just another homeless man, someone people walked past without a second glance. Some dropped a coin or two into his cup, but most ignored him, as if he were part of the scenery, like a lamppost or a bench. Day after day, year after year, he was there, a silent witness to the world moving around him. But no one ever stopped to wonder who he was, where he came from, or why he was there. Until one day, everything changed. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and the sky is a clear, bright blue. The man was in his usual spot, sitting quietly with his cup in front of him. People passed by as they always did, some glancing at him briefly, others not at all. But then, something unusual happened. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. The vehicle idled for a moment, as if the driver was hesitating, and then the back door opened. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He walked straight toward the homeless man, his expression unreadable. The people nearby slowed their steps, curious about what was happening. Was this some kind of charity worker? A police officer? Or something else entirely? The suited man crouched down, bringing himself eye level with the homeless man. He spoke softly, his words too quiet for anyone else to hear. The homeless man's face changed, his eyes widened, his hands trembled, and for the first time in years, he looked like he was truly seen. The suited man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny object. It glinted in the sunlight, but no one could tell what it was. He handed it to the homeless man, who stared at it in disbelief. The suited man said a few more words, then stood up and walked back to the SUV. The homeless man watched as the vehicle drove away, disappearing into the flow of traffic. He sat there, clutching the object in his hand, his mind clearly racing. What had just happened? Who was that man in the SUV? And why, after all these years, had someone finally noticed him? The people who had witnessed the scene whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. But no one had any answers. The homeless man didn't move from his spot for the rest of the day. He just sat there, staring at the object in his hand, lost in thought. As the sun set and the streets grew quiet, he finally stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked around, as if seeing the world for the first time. And then he walked away, leaving his usual corner empty. No one knew where he was going or what he was planning to do. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary day, and the man they had ignored for so long was no ordinary homeless person. Something big was about to happen, and it all started with that black SUV. The next morning, the corner was still empty. The homeless man didn't return. People began to talk, rumors spreading like wildfire. Some said he had been taken away by the government. Others thought he might have won the lottery. But no one knew for sure. All they knew was that the man, who had been a constant presence in their lives for 17 years, was gone, and the mystery of the black SUV remained unsolved. Who was he? What was the object he had been given? And why had it taken so long for someone to notice him? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, leaving everyone who had seen the event on edge. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change everything they thought they knew about the man they had ignored for so long. And as the days passed, the tension grew, because whatever was coming next, it was going to be big. The disappearance of the homeless man didn't go unnoticed for long. By midday, the corner where he had sat for nearly 2 decades was buzzing with activity. People who had walked past him every day without a second thought suddenly couldn't stop talking about him. Shopkeepers leaned out of their doors, speculating with customers. Office workers on their lunch breaks huddled in small groups, sharing theories. Even the local news caught wind of the story, sending a reporter to interview anyone who might have seen what happened. But no one had any real answers. All they had were questions and a growing sense that something extraordinary was unfolding right in front of them. One of the most curious onlookers was Maria, a barista at the coffee shop across the street. She had seen the homeless man every morning for the past 5 years, always in the same spot, always quiet and unassuming. She'd even given him a free coffee once or twice when the winter mornings were particularly cold. But like everyone else, she had never really seen him. Not until that day. She had been wiping down the counter when the black SUV pulled up, and she had watched the entire scene unfold through the window. The suited man, the shiny object, the look on the homeless man's face. It had all been so strange, so out of place. And now, with him gone, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? What had that man in the SUV said to him? And why did it feel like something important had just slipped through her fingers? Maria wasn't the only one asking these questions. Across town, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a man named David was pacing his living room, his mind racing. David had been one of the few people who had actually spoken to the homeless man over the years. He'd stopped to chat with him once, years ago, when he was going through a rough patch in his own life. The homeless man had listened quietly, then offered a few words of wisdom that had stuck with David ever since. Sometimes, the man had said, "The hardest thing is not losing what you have, but finding what you've lost." At the time, David hadn't understood what he meant. But now, with the man gone, those words echoed in his mind like a riddle he couldn't solve. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery only deepened. The homeless man didn't return to his corner, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. The shiny object he had been given remained a mystery, too. Some people claimed it was a key, others said it was a locket or a piece of jewelry. But no one could say for sure. The black SUV hadn't been seen again either, and the man in the suit seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was as if the entire event had been a dream, something too strange to be real. But the empty corner was a constant reminder that it had happened and that something bigger was at play. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit office on the other side of the city, a woman named Evelyn was poring over a stack of old files. Evelyn was a private investigator, and she had been hired by an anonymous client to look into the homeless man's disappearance. The client hadn't given her much to go on, just a name, John, and a vague description of the black SUV. But Evelyn was good at her job, and she had a feeling this case was going to be unlike any she had worked on before. As she sifted through the files, she began to piece together a picture of the man everyone had ignored for so long. He had once been a successful businessman, with a wife and a young daughter. But something had happened, something tragic, and his life had fallen apart. Evelyn didn't know the details yet, but she was determined to find out. Her investigation led her to an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, but Evelyn could tell that someone had been there recently. The front door was slightly ajar, and there were fresh footprints in the dirt. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under her feet as she made her way through the empty rooms. In the kitchen, she found a small table with a single chair, and on the table was a photograph. It was old and faded, but she could still make out the faces. A man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling for the camera. The man was younger, but there was no mistaking him. It was the homeless man. Evelyn's heart raced as she picked up the photograph. This was it, the clue she had been looking for. But before she could examine it further, she heard a noise. Behind her, she spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind rattling the windows and the faint creak of the floorboards. She told herself it was nothing, but the feeling of being watched lingered as she left the house and headed back to her car. She didn't know it yet, but she was closer to the truth than she realized, and closer to danger, too. Back in the city, the rumors about the homeless man continued to spread. Some people claimed they had seen him in different parts of town, always alone, always moving quickly, as if he were trying to avoid being noticed. Others said they had heard whispers about a secret organization, a group of powerful people who had been watching him for years. But no one could say for sure what was true and what was just speculation. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the man they had ignored for so long was no ordinary homeless person. He had a story that was far from over. And then, one night, something happened that changed everything. Maria was closing up the coffee shop when she saw a figure standing across the street, under the glow of a streetlight. At first, she thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as she looked closer, she realized it was him, the homeless man. He was wearing clean clothes, and his face was no longer hidden beneath a scruffy beard. He looked different, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. He didn't seem to notice her. He was staring at something in his hand. The shiny object, she realized, and his expression was one of deep concentration. Before she could call out to him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Maria stood there for a long time, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to do. Should she follow him? Should she call the police? Or should she just let it go? Pretend she hadn't seen anything? In the end, she did nothing. But as she locked up the shop and headed home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The homeless man was back, and whatever he was planning, it was going to change everything. The question was, how? And who else was involved? The answers were out there, somewhere, hidden in the shadows. And as the city slept, the mystery deepened, the tension grew, and the story of the man no one had noticed continued to unfold. The sighting of the homeless man, John, as Evelyn had discovered his name to be, sent ripples through the small circle of people who had become inexplicably tied to his story. Maria couldn't shake the image of him standing under the streetlight, holding that mysterious object. She tried to convince herself it was none of her business, but something about the way he had looked, so focused, so determined, kept pulling her back. The next morning, she found herself walking the streets near the coffee shop, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, hoping to catch another glimpse of him. She didn't know what she would do if she saw him again, but she couldn't just let it go. Not now. Meanwhile, David, the man who had once shared a brief but meaningful conversation with John, was also grappling with his own curiosity. He had heard the rumors about John's reappearance, and it had stirred something deep within him. That conversation years ago had stayed with him, like a puzzle he couldn't solve. He decided to take a walk to the old corner where John used to sit, hoping to find some clue, some sign of where he might have gone. But the corner was still empty, just as it had been for weeks. As David stood there, he noticed something small and shiny glinting in the sunlight near the curb. He bent down to pick it up, a tiny silver key, no bigger than his thumbnail. His heart skipped a beat. Could this be the object John had been given? And if so, what did it unlock? Evelyn, the private investigator, was making progress of her own. Her visit to the abandoned house had left her with more questions than answers, but it had also given her a lead. The photograph she had found, the one of John with his family, had a date scrawled on the back, June 15, 2005. She spent hours digging through old records, trying to piece together what had happened around that time. What she found was a tragedy. John's wife and daughter had been involved in a car accident on that very date. His wife had died instantly, and his daughter had been left in a coma. The medical bills had drained John's savings, and he had lost his business shortly after. By the time his daughter passed away a year later, John had disappeared from public life, leaving behind no trace, until he resurfaced as the homeless man everyone ignored. Evelyn's discovery only deepened the mystery. Why had John chosen to live on the streets for 17 years? And what had changed now? She couldn't shake the feeling that the black SUV and the shiny object were connected to his past, but she didn't know how. Her anonymous client had gone silent, leaving her with no new instructions, and she was starting to wonder if she was being watched. Every time she left her office, she felt a pair of eyes on her, though she could never spot anyone following her. It was unnerving, but it also fueled her determination. She wasn't just solving a case anymore. She was unraveling a story that had been buried for far too long. As these threads began to intertwine, another player entered the scene, a young journalist named Liam. He had been assigned to cover the growing buzz around the homeless man's disappearance and reappearance, but what started as a routine assignment quickly turned into something much bigger. Liam had a knack for digging up stories no one else could, and he sensed that this one was special. He tracked down Maria at the coffee shop, hoping to get her side of the story. At first, she was hesitant to talk, but something about Liam's earnestness made her open up. She told him about the black SUV, the suited man, and the shiny object. She even mentioned the silver key David had found, though she didn't know his name. Liam's eyes lit up as he scribbled notes. This was the break he had been looking for. Liam's investigation led him to David, who was still puzzling over the silver key. The two men met at a quiet park bench, and David handed the key to Liam, hoping the journalist might have some insight. Liam turned it over in his hands, his mind racing. It was too small to be a house key, too intricate to be for a padlock. Could it be a safe deposit box key? Or maybe something even more obscure? Liam promised David he would look into it, and the two agreed to stay in touch. As Liam walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something big, something that could make his career. But not everyone was interested in uncovering the truth. In a sleek, high-rise office downtown, a man in a tailored suit sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of John. The man's name was Victor, and he was the one who had sent the black SUV to pick up John that day. Victor had been watching John for years, waiting for the right moment to make contact. Now that the moment had come, he knew things were about to get complicated. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "We need to speed things up," he said to the person on the other end, "before someone else figures it out." Back on the streets, John was still on the move. He had been staying in abandoned buildings, moving from place to place to avoid being seen. The shiny object, a small, intricately designed locket, was always in his hand, as if it held the answers to everything. He didn't know who had sent the man in the black SUV, but he knew one thing. The locket was a message from his past, a clue to something he had lost long ago. He just had to figure out what it meant. As he walked through the city, his mind raced with memories of his wife, his daughter, the life he had once had. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. The tension was building, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. Maria, David, Evelyn, Liam. They were all connected now, each one playing a part in the story of the man no one had noticed. But the biggest questions remained unanswered. Who was behind the black SUV? What was the significance of the locket and the key? And what was John planning to do next? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the danger. Because one thing was clear. Someone didn't want the truth to come out, and they would do whatever it took to keep it buried.